And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Well, in case you haven't noticed, it turns out that today is Thanksgiving Sunday. Or as some people call it, Pilgrim Sunday. When I was a kid growing up in this church, I remember coming here every Thanksgiving Sunday. It was one day that my father never wanted to miss. That opening hymn I love hearing, and it brings back so many great memories. Now, you think that we do Thanksgiving here big. When I went down to Houston, Texas, to the church down there, they had an entire Saturday-long Pilgrim Festival the Saturday before Thanksgiving. We're talking, they had, when you showed up, you would get a name of all the different Mayflower passengers and their little biography. As you kept going around, there was a petting zoo, but there were also various historical things and foods you could buy. There was even stocks that you could sit in and get your, put it in and get your picture taken. And then the next day, the entire congregation would show up dressed either as a pilgrim or a Native American. And the service was a very old school service with a beadle who would wake you up if you fell asleep during the service. And again, if you go outside New England, so many of the congregational churches outside New England proudly bear the name either Pilgrim or Plymouth Congregational Church. It's a big deal. But, of course, times do change. And now that we're in the 21st century, there's a degree of unease that people have about our Pilgrim and Puritan heritage. First of all, Puritans don't exactly have the best press. I mean, who wants to say, oh, what church are you in? Oh, I'm in a congregational church. Oh, what's that? Oh, it's the Church of the Puritans. And people are like, oh, yes, I can't wait to check that one out. But also more recently, there are very real concerns and very real questions that are raised about the European colonization of North and South America and the resulting genocide of the indigenous folks that were here. And while the Pilgrims and Puritans were only one part of a much larger movement, they were still part of that. They were colonizers when they came here. And there are issues that we have to wrestle with when we think about that, and those issues are worthwhile, and I hope at some point we do think through those things deeply. But also at the same time, these reservations about the Pilgrims and Puritans doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about them at all. Because I do believe in that heritage and our heritage, there are things that are worthy of note, things that are worthy of lifting up and learning from even today. So today, I'm not actually going to talk about the Pilgrims. I know that sounds like a disappointment. Instead, I'm focusing on the cousins, the Puritans, those folks who were settling in this area right around here. Now, the most famous article, you knew I'd get academic at some point. The most famous article written on the Puritans is an article by the Harvard scholar Perry Miller entitled Errand into the Wilderness. Now, Miller starts off this article with listing out some of the Jeremiads of the 1660s and 1670s. I love that word Jeremiad, from the prophet Jeremiah. This is the great denunciation of the moral degradation of society. And so these Puritan ministers, dressed probably somewhat similar to this, would get up in their pulpits on the election day or different days, and they would decry the sins of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Oh, how they have backslid into this horrible state that they find themselves in the 1660s and 1670s. This culminated in the Great Reforming Synod of 1679. And as I was reading through the various sins that were being talked about, one of them that jumped out at me was sleeping in church. This was such a common problem, apparently, that they had to highlight it in the Reforming Synod of 1679. Now, Miller points out an interesting thing, though. Miller says, okay, you have these different Jeremiads, you have people wringing their hands, but then nothing changes fundamentally in society. Miller's like, is there something else going on here with these Jeremiads? It's almost as though society wants to have that moment of purgation and then just move on, that we can self-flagellate for a little bit and then just carry on like we've always been doing. And so Miller asked, is there something else going on here? And what Miller found was One of the things that changed from that first generation of Puritans to that second generation that had all these Jeremiads was a sense of mission. So you'll recall from your American history, in the 1620s, England had a lot of troubles that were going on. You had a major economic crisis in England in the 1620s. You had a relatively new king, King Charles I, who was, at the very least, extremely arrogant. You had wars that were failed wars with France that were going on, and also you had Archbishop William Laud, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a high Anglo-Catholic, who made it his purpose in life to persecute any of the Puritans who were there in England. And so it seemed at the time for those in the 1620s that God was punishing England, that there was a real spiritual crisis going on in England. And so some of the leading citizens of England, including John Winthrop and others, left England to come to Massachusetts Bay to establish a new colony. And unlike the other colonies, the purpose of this colony was not to go make money. They had a much higher purpose than that. They were, according to Miller, on this great errand. They were going out to show England and those other people in the world what it would look like if you made a true biblical commonwealth. The idea was if Massachusetts Bay could actually live according to biblical principles from top to bottom, create the perfect society from the root up, that it would be so amazing, God would bless it so much, that England would see it, the rest of the world would see it, and they'd be like, aha, that's what we need to do. I didn't mean to do that. It's a very nice display. I'll stand here. But there was this sense in that first generation that they had this high calling, and that within a few years, people would see all the great things in Massachusetts Bay and change their ways, maybe even invite them back to London to take leadership roles in the new government. And so that's why Massachusetts Bay was able to attract so many great leading lights like Thomas Hooker and John Cotton, among many others. But then a funny thing happened. You had the English Civil War. These tensions in England between Parliament and the King exploded in the English Civil War, and the English Civil War ended with the Puritans winning. But the Puritans who won didn't necessarily like the example in Massachusetts Bay, with its deep intolerance, for instance. And so actually they kind of ignored Massachusetts Bay. And then in 1660, Charles II is restored as the King of England, and then really no one cared what was going on here. And so this first generation that had this high holy purpose, they were on this errand to the world to make things different. The second generation turned around and they were just left with the wilderness. Miller ends his essay with this great line where he said, having failed to fix the eyes of the world upon their city on the hill, they were left alone with America. Now, our reading in Ephesians, that Harriet did a great job of working through, our reading in Ephesians is Paul writing to the church in Ephesus and saying to these Christians, you are chosen ones. You are blessed. You are part of this great inheritance. You have been chosen before the foundation of the world to be part of this grand plan that God is doing, that will culminate in the fullness of time as everything is gathered together with Jesus Christ as its head. It's this incredibly hopeful text saying, you are special, you are part of something great. And indeed, the Ephesians, the early Christians, you think about it, the early Christian movement started with 12 dudes and a whole bunch of women as well. They tend not to get as much airtime in the Bible. But a small group of folks that then ended up changing the world. They actually did change the world. It's not often when a small group of people end up changing the course of history. The early Christians did. Paul captures that sense of mission in these opening lines from Ephesians. And indeed, there are various points within Christian history, within American history, where there has been that sense of mission, that sense of purpose, that sense of errand that these first generation of Puritans had. For instance, during the Second Great Awakening, a little more American history for you. During the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, you had a group of students out at Williams College, a handful of students at Williams College in 1806, who felt a call to spread the gospel to the world. And those students, 4 years later, helped found the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the first foreign missionary organization in the US. And within a few decades, there were missionaries from New England all over the globe. They had a sense of purpose, and they were dedicated to it. At this time, you had prison reform movements. Prisons up to this time had been places of punishment. And all of a sudden, there was a movement at this time to have prisons be turned into penitentiaries where people would be reformed. You had the first beginning of public schools. You had the abolition movement. You had the women's rights movement. This was all an outgrowth of this incredible sense of mission and purpose that was there in the Second Great Awakening. Later in the 19th century, you had folks in the social gospel movement who felt dearly and deeply about trying to deal with the ills of society that industrialization had given rise to. So much of what we have today is from that. The women having the right to vote, the Food and Drug Administration to make sure companies are not taking advantage of consumers. All that grows out of this social gospel movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You have the civil rights movement. You have people feeling a sense of purpose and errand. So what about today? I look around today and it seems much more like we're that second generation of Puritans than the first generation. It seems like it's just, as the French would say, metro boulot dodo. It's like you get on the metro, you go to work, you go to bed, you repeat. Where is that sense of purpose? That broader sense of you're part of something great and grand that's going to have an impact. What is it for you? Is there that legacy there? Willa Cather, in her book My Antonia, has this wonderful line where she says, "That is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. To be a part of something larger." There's a book that came out probably 30 years ago now called Flow by a social psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Probably butchering his name, and he studied human happiness, and he had human beings go around all day long and figure out when they were happiest. And he figured out human beings were happiest when they're in these flow states. It's a great book, it's worth reading, but one of the elements of the flow state is that you're part of something greater, that your actions actually have a purpose, that you're on some sort of errand. And so the question is, for you, for us, what errand do we want to be on? What larger purpose are you a part of? That can leave a legacy beyond just yourself. You're just one individual, but when you're part of something bigger, there's that impact of a potential legacy that can change the world. That's what the Puritans thought. That's what motivated them to come here. We have this incredible opportunity. We're in a situation in the United States today where solutions almost certainly are not going to come from Washington. Washington is fundamentally dysfunctional and broken in a lot of core ways. And the creative solutions in America are going to come from states and local governments. That's where creativity comes from. I mean, look at the Affordable Care Act that came from Massachusetts right here. In our local communities, we have a chance to do things that can have an impact on our local communities, but also be part of larger movements across the country. We here are part of a congregation that has incredible resources in terms of intellectual capital, social capital, and financial capital. You combine a congregation like this with the village church, with Temple Beth Elohim and St. Andrews and other communities of faith around, think of what can actually happen. An enormous amount. The question is, what errand do you want to be a part of? So this Thursday, you'll be gathering for your Thanksgiving meals. You'll have a chance to share a wonderful feast with your family and friends. And as you're doing that, think for a moment about those Puritan forebears who might be standing around you, who had a great errand to come here and plant Massachusetts Bay, and ask yourself, what errand is God calling you to? And how can you inspire the rest of us to join you on that mission? I want to hear about that. But it'll come from you, and it'll come from the Spirit of God calling you in that direction.